I pulled a 16-year-old boy out of the ocean with my bare hands, and for 12 years I told myself that was the end of the story. I never learned his name. I never saw his face again after the ambulance lights disappeared down the coast road. I built a whole life around forgetting that night, because remembering it meant remembering everything I lost in the same storm. Then, on an ordinary gray morning, a stranger walked up to the lighthouse with a rolled-up set of blueprints under his arm and asked if I was the man who used to keep this light. His voice was calm. His eyes were not. And in his jacket pocket, half hidden, I saw something that made my hands go cold. Something I thought had sunk to the bottom of the sea 12 years ago. I asked him who he was. He said, "You don't recognize me. But I've spent 12 years trying to find the man who wouldn't let me die." But what happened next changed my life forever. Elias Marsh had not expected to feel anything when the black car pulled up along the gravel road beneath the lighthouse, because in 11 years of solitary keeping, nothing in that particular arrival announced itself as different from any other delivery, any other inspector, any other stranger sent by the Coast Authority to tell him the light was being decommissioned again. He was on the gallery deck oiling the hinge of the lantern room door, the wind coming hard off the gray water the way it always did in the late months of the year, and he did not turn around until he heard the gate creak, and even then he only half turned, the way a man turns when he expects to be disappointed by what he sees. What he saw instead was a tall man in a charcoal coat, maybe 28 years old, dark hair pushed back by the wind, standing very still at the bottom of the tower stairs like he was afraid the ground itself might change its mind about holding him. The man did not call up a greeting. He simply looked up at Elias with an expression that belonged to someone doing long division in his head, and said, "Are you Elias Marsh?" Elias came down slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, and said that he was, and asked what the county wanted this time, because that was always the shape strangers took here. Men with clipboards asking about erosion reports or budget cuts. But the man said he wasn't from the county. He said his name was Noah Calloway, that he was a structural engineer, that he had been hired to survey the lighthouse for a preservation grant, and that this was, without question, true because he did in fact unroll blueprints on the hood of his car and speak fluently about lantern room load-bearing walls and corrosion in the iron staircase. But underneath the professional register of his voice there was something else moving, something careful, the way a man is careful when he is holding a full glass of water across a room he has not measured. It was on the third evening, after 2 days of surveys and measurements and the two of them falling into an easy, wordless rhythm of passing each other coffee and holding ladders steady, that Elias noticed the thing in Noah's coat pocket. It was small brass, split cleanly down the middle as if by some old injury, half of a whistle worn smooth by years of a thumb rubbing over it. Elias's whole chest went tight, because he had the other half in a drawer in the keeper's house, wrapped in a handkerchief, untouched since the night the sea had taken more from him than a boy's name. 12 years ago, in a storm that the Coast Guard still used as a training case for how quickly weather could turn on this stretch of shoreline, a fishing boat carrying 2 teenage brothers had capsized less than half a mile from the light. Elias, 21 then and new to keeping, had gone out in the department's skiff against every order given to him, because the alternative was standing on the shore listening to 2 boys drown in the dark. He had found one of them clinging to a buoy line, blue-lipped, barely conscious, a boy who would not stop screaming a name that wasn't his own into the wind, his brother's name, even as Elias hauled him bodily into the skiff. Elias had gone back out for the second boy. He had not found him. The storm took the search from him before the search could take anything back. What the sea returned instead, 3 days later, was a broken life jacket, a shredded coat, and half of a brass whistle, tangled in kelp 50 yards down the beach, which Elias picked up with the strange, irrational tenderness of a man who has run out of anything real to hold on to. He never learned the name of the boy he saved, because the ambulance had come fast, and the county reassigned him within the month for psychological review after he refused 3 separate times to stop searching for the second brother's body. And by the time he came back to keep this same light 2 years later under a different superintendent, the case had gone cold and quiet the way all things eventually did at the edge of the world. Noah Calloway had spent those same 12 years learning how to disappear inside competence, because competence, unlike grief, could be measured and finished and handed in on a deadline. He became an engineer because engineers dealt in structures that either held weight or did not, and there was a mercy in that, a relief from the unbearable ambiguity of the night his younger brother, Sam, had begged him to take the boat out because Sam had wanted, one last time before their father sold it, to see the lighthouse beam up close from the water. Noah had said yes. Noah had been the one steering when the swell rose without warning. Noah had held onto the buoy line screaming his brother's name while a stranger's hands hauled him into a skiff he did not remember boarding. And Noah had spent every year since building smaller and smaller rooms inside himself to keep that scream from getting out. He had taken the lighthouse assignment the moment he saw the address, not entirely admitting to himself why, telling his firm it was professional interest in coastal heritage architecture, telling himself the same lie until the moment he stood at the bottom of those stairs and recognized, without any memory of the man's face, something in the particular economy of Elias's movements, the way he crossed a room like he was still listening for someone calling from the water. It was Elias who said it first on the fourth night, sitting across from Noah at the small table in the keeper's house kitchen with the storm shutters rattling gently in a wind that was, for once, not dangerous, only present. He said, without looking up from his coffee, "I have the other half of that whistle." Noah went very still. He did not ask how Elias knew, because some part of him had known since the first afternoon that this was not a coincidence he had walked into but a debt he had finally come to collect from himself. He said quietly that his brother's name was Sam, that he had begged Sam to stay home that night and Sam had refused, that for 12 years he had told the story to himself with the details reversed, because it was easier to carry the guilt of a boy who begged to go than a boy who was begged and refused, and admitting the truth out loud in that small kitchen felt like removing a splinter that had been buried so long it had become mistaken for bone. Elias, in turn, told him about the reassignment, the psychological review, the 2 years he could not go near open water without his hands shaking, the way he had built an entire life out of tending one small flame at the edge of the world because it was the one thing he could keep from going out. Neither man cried, not yet, but something between them shifted the register of the room, the way a held breath changes the pressure in a house before rain. What grew after that was not immediate, and it was not a rescue narrative repeating itself. It was two men learning to sit in the same silence without flinching from it. Noah stayed on past the survey's deadline, first citing follow-up measurements, then not citing anything at all. They walked the tide line in the mornings, Noah asking careful questions about the mechanics of the lantern's rotation, Elias answering with more words than he had used with another person in years. Noah found himself waiting for the particular quiet 10 minutes before dusk when Elias climbed to light the lamp, standing at the base of the tower just to watch him do it, telling himself it was curiosity and knowing by the second week that it was something closer to devotion. Elias found himself, for the first time since the storm, saying a full sentence about his father, who had also kept this light before him and been lost to a smaller, quieter kind of storm, the slow one called illness, that had taken him the same winter Elias buried himself in this work. Noah listened to all of it the way he had once listened to Sam explain constellations, with a full and undivided attention that felt, to Elias, like being handed back a piece of himself he had misplaced at sea. The wound in the story surfaced only when Noah's firm called him back for a final decision on the grant, 3 weeks in, and it forced from him an honesty he had been circling. Not a lie, but an omission he had allowed to stand. He had not simply been assigned this project. He had requested it by name, 6 months earlier, after finally tracking down which lighthouse keeper had answered the distress call that night, using nothing but old shipping logs and a stubbornness his therapist had called, not unkindly, productive obsession. He told Elias this on the gallery deck, the two of them looking out at gray water gone gold at the edges with the last of the light, and he watched Elias's face for the anger he was certain he deserved for turning a stranger's grief into a research project. But what moved across Elias's face instead was something gentler and more complicated, recognition mostly, that he had done an almost identical thing in reverse, keeping the other half of that whistle in a drawer for 12 years the way some men keep a photograph, unable to throw it away and unable to look at it directly either. "You didn't use me," Elias said. "You found the only person who might understand what you survived." That's not the same thing as a lie. It was the truth of the twist when it finally surfaced, not a shocking reveal built for its own sake, but the quiet admission that both men had spent over a decade orbiting the same unhealed wound from opposite shores, each one believing he alone carried it. The climax came, as these things sometimes cruelly do, with weather. A storm rolled in off the water 2 nights before Noah was scheduled to leave for good, faster and harder than the forecasts had promised. The kind of storm that made the old glass in the lantern room shudder in its brass housing. Word came over the radio that a fishing skiff, two amateur weekend sailors caught unprepared. Had lost engine power less than a mile out, close enough to see the light but too far to reach it under or power alone before the tide turned against them. The Coast Guard boat was 40 minutes out. Elias stood at the top of the stairs with his hand on the door, and for the first time in 12 years Noah watched the old fear take him bodily, watched his knuckles go white on the frame, and understood in that instant that Elias had never actually recovered from that first storm. He had only built a lighthouse-shaped cage around the fear and called it healing. It would have been easy and expected for Noah to go instead, to be the one who ran toward the water this time in some tidy reversal of roles. He did not. He put his hand over Elias's on the door and said the only true thing he had. "I'm not asking you to save me again. I'm asking you to let me go out there with you." They took the skiff together, Elias at the engine with hands that shook and then steadied, Noah in the bow with a line and a light, and they found the two sailors clinging to their capsized hull within 20 minutes, cold but alive, and hauled them in exactly the way Elias had once hauled in a screaming 16-year-old boy, except this time there were two sets of hands doing the work, and this time no one went back out alone into water that did not give anyone back. They did not speak on the return, not because there was nothing to say but because everything that needed saying had already happened in the boat. It was only after, standing soaked and shaking in the warm low light of the keeper's house, stripping off wet coats with hands still unsteady from cold and adrenaline both, that Elias finally reached into the kitchen drawer and took out the handkerchief he had kept for 12 years, and unwrapped it, and set his half of the brass whistle on the table beside Noah's. Neither half alone made a sound. Fitted together, turned once in Noah's palm, it caught the lamp light and looked, for the first time since the sea broke it, whole. Elias said that he had never let himself hope that the boy he pulled from the water that night had lived a life good enough to come back looking for the person who saved him. Noah said that he had never let himself hope that the man he'd been searching for could turn out to be someone he'd want to stay with, rather than someone he simply owed. What passed between them then was not a dramatic declaration but something quieter and more durable. Noah's hand closing over Elias's on the table, and Elias, after 12 years of speaking mostly to the sea, finally saying a name that was not his father's and not his brother's but his own truth, out loud, to another person who had earned the right to hear it. Noah did not go back to the city at the end of that week, nor the week after. He took on the lighthouse's full restoration as his firm's flagship heritage project and never quite finished making excuses to stay past its completion. The keeper's house gained a second set of boots by the door, a second coffee cup on the drying rack, a small brass whistle, whole again, hung on a nail by the window where the light could catch it every evening when Elias climbed the tower to do the one thing he had never stopped doing even in his worst years, keeping a flame burning for whoever might be lost in the dark and looking for a way home. Some nights, when new storms rolled in, Noah still felt the old fear rise in his chest, and some nights Elias's hands still remembered how to shake before they remembered how to hold steady. But they had learned, finally, the thing neither man had known 12 years ago in that first terrible water. That surviving a storm alone can look very much like drowning slowly for the rest of your life, and that the boy who is pulled from the sea and the man who does the pulling are never really strangers to each other again. Not really, not once the debt between them has quietly, patiently, turned into love that I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me. The night I lost a boy to the sea and gained a stranger I could never forget. I thought healing meant the story was finished. I was wrong. Because 6 months after Noah Calloway stayed, after the whistle was whole again on its nail by the window, a letter arrived at the lighthouse with a name on it neither of us expected to see again. A name that belonged to the family of the second brother, the one the sea never gave back. They wanted to meet the man who tried to save him. And Noah wanted to go with me. What waited for us in that meeting room would either close the last wound of that storm forever, or tear open every fragile thing we had only just finished building. But what happened next changed my life forever. The letter came on a Tuesday, plain and unremarkable in a stack of restoration invoices and grant paperwork, and Elias almost set it aside twice before he registered the return address. A small town 4 hours inland that meant nothing to him until he opened the envelope and read the name signed at the bottom. Margaret Calloway, Noah's mother. He stood very still in the kitchen with the paper in his hand for long enough that Noah, coming in from the tower stairs with sawdust on his sleeves from patching a window frame, asked what was wrong before Elias could find words to answer. The letter was short. It said that Margaret had recently found, going through her late husband's old files, the Coast Guard incident report from the night her sons went into the water, and that had never before seen the keeper's name attached to it, only a case number, and that for 12 years had wanted to write to whoever had gone out in that storm and had never known who to address it to. Said understood if it was too painful to respond. Said only wanted, before got any older, to say thank you to the man who brought one of her boys home alive. Noah read it over Elias's shoulder twice, and the color went out of his face the way it did on nights when the old fear surfaced without warning, and he said very quietly that his mother did not know he had gone looking for Elias at all, that in 12 years of grief so total it had rearranged the furniture of their family permanently. The subject of that night had become something none of them spoke of directly, a wound so central to the household that everyone had agreed, without ever agreeing out loud, to build their lives carefully around its edges rather than ever touch it again. Noah had told his mother only that he was working on a lighthouse restoration on the coast. He had never told her which coast or which lighthouse, or whose hands had pulled him out of the water that night, because some part of him had been afraid that naming Elias to his family would make the debt between them a matter of record rather than something private and unfinished that belonged only to the two of them. Now his mother had found it anyway, on her own, through an old file, and the two threads Noah had kept so carefully separate for 6 months. The family he had grown up grieving inside, and the man he had quietly fallen in love with while trying to make peace with that grief, were about to be pulled into the same room whether either of them was ready or not. They wrote back together, sitting at the same small kitchen table where the whistle had first been made whole, taking turns drafting sentences and crossing them out, because there was no correct way to answer a woman thanking you for saving one of her sons while had spent 12 years burying the other. In the end they sent something simple and true, that Elias had never stopped thinking of that night, that he would be honored to meet her, and that this was the sentence Noah insisted on over Elias's initial objection that it might be too much too soon. Her son Noah was, at present, the reason the lighthouse and its keeper were both, for the first time in over a decade, doing well. Margaret wrote back within the week asking them to come for a Sunday lunch, and included, almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the page, a line that made both men go quiet at the table. Said still kept Sam's room exactly as it had been, and that thought, after 12 years, might finally be ready to let someone besides herself walk into it. The 4-hour drive inland was the longest conversation Elias and Noah had had since the night of the second storm. Not because either of them was withholding anything, but because there was, at last, room enough between them to say things slowly instead of only in crisis. Noah talked, for the first time in any real detail, about who Sam had actually been. Not the ghost of a scream in a dark ocean, but a 15-year-old boy obsessed with lighthouses and constellations in exactly the kind of overlapping, restless way certain boys become obsessed with two things that don't obviously belong together. A boy who kept a notebook of every lighthouse on the eastern seaboard and had begged, that final night, not for adventure or thrill but simply to see, up close on the water, the specific beam that Elias himself now lit every evening. Elias, in turn, told Noah about his own father for the first time without the flattening grief shorthand he usually used, describing instead the particular sound of his father's boots on the tower stairs, the way his father had taught him to read weather in the color of the horizon before any radio forecast confirmed it, the last conversation they'd had before the illness took the last of his lucidity, in which his father had made him promise to keep the light going even after he was gone. A promise Elias had kept so literally and so completely that he had, without quite noticing, turned an act of love into a form of solitary confinement. Margaret Calloway's house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with maples just beginning to turn, and was waiting on the porch before the car had even come to a full stop in the driveway. A small, straight-backed woman with Noah's same careful eyes, and when Elias got out of the car crossed the yard and took both of his hands in hers without a word of introduction needed, because some griefs recognize each other on sight, held his hands for a long moment, studying his face the way a person studies a photograph they've only ever seen described to them, and then said, simply, "You brought him back to me," and Elias, who had spent 12 years unable to say a single sentence about that night to anyone who hadn't been in the water with him, found himself telling her, on her own porch in real and unhurried detail, exactly what had happened, the order of the waves, the sound Noah had made calling his brother's name, the moment his hand had finally closed around Noah's wrist in the dark. Margaret listened to all of it without flinching, nodding at certain details as though were finally filling in the edges of a picture had lived inside for 12 years only in silhouette. Lunch was long and, Against every fear either man had carried into that house, gentle. Margaret's husband had passed 3 years earlier, and lived alone now except for a tabby cat who took an immediate and proprietary interest in Elias's lap, which Margaret said, with the first real laugh either of them had heard from her, was the cat's way of announcing that Elias was allowed to stay. It was after lunch, as the light through the kitchen window went long in gold in the particular way autumn afternoons do, that Margaret asked, without any weight of demand in her voice, whether Elias might like to see Sam's room. Noah's hand found Elias's under the table before either of them had decided to reach for the other, and together, with Margaret leading, they went up the narrow staircase to a door that had, by all evidence, not been opened for anyone outside the family in over a decade. The room was smaller than Elias had imagined and more alive than he had prepared for. Not a shrine exactly, though it had the careful stillness of one, but a real teenage boy's room caught mid-sentence, star charts taped in. Overlapping layers across one wall, a shelf of lighthouse photographs clipped from magazines and pinned beside hand-drawn diagrams in a shaky adolescent hand. A single unfinished model of a Fresnel lens built from cardboard and glue sitting on the desk exactly where it had been left. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 12 years finally, quietly, let go. Not grief exactly, though the grief was there too, but a kind of recognition, the sense of standing inside proof that the boy he had not been able to save had been real and whole and full of exactly the kind of stubborn, curious love of the sea that Elias himself had spent his whole life organizing his days around. He picked up the cardboard lens model with careful hands and asked Margaret if knew what Sam had wanted to be, and Margaret said, her voice steady but her eyes bright, that Sam had wanted, more than anything, to keep a lighthouse of his own one day, and that had never told anyone that detail because it had felt, for 12 years, too painful to say out loud, until now, in this room, with the man who had tried to save him standing there holding the very thing Sam had spent so many nights building. It was Noah who spoke next, quietly, from the doorway, his voice thick in a way Elias had heard only once before, on the gallery deck the night of the second storm. He said that he had spent 12 years believing that surviving instead of Sam was a kind of theft, a debt he owed and could never repay, and that some part of him had gone looking for Elias not to find comfort but almost to be punished, to hear from the one other person who had been there that night that he, Noah, should have been the one who didn't make it back. He said that what he had found instead, slowly over 6 impossible months, was a man who had spent the same 12 years punishing himself for the exact same night in the exact opposite direction, and that somewhere in the space between their two guilts they had built something that neither grief alone could have made. An actual life together worth living rather than merely surviving. Margaret crossed the small room and put her hand on her son's face the way mothers do when words run out, and said that Sam, whoever he might have become, would have wanted exactly this. His brother alive and loved, and standing in a room full of lighthouses with the very man who had once pulled him from the sea. They stayed in that house until well past dark, longer than any of them had planned, Margaret insisting they take the last train back in the morning instead of driving home exhausted, and it was past midnight, in the quiet guest room at the top of the stairs, that Noah finally said the thing he had been circling since the letter first arrived. He said that for 12 years he had thought forgiveness was something that had to be earned, drop by drop, through enough good behavior and enough quiet penance to outweigh the debt of having lived. He said that standing in Sam's room that afternoon, he had understood for the first time that forgiveness wasn't a ledger that could ever be balanced that way, that his mother had never been waiting for him to earn his way back into being loved, and that Elias had never needed the whole ocean returned to him in order to deserve the small, ordinary happiness of another person's hand in his. Elias, lying beside him in the dark, said that he had spent 12 years keeping a light burning at the edge of the world because he believed it was the only apology large enough for a boy he couldn't save, and that it had taken Noah walking up those tower stairs with a set of blueprints under his arm to teach him that a life built entirely out of penance eventually stops being able to hold any joy at all, that the light was still worth keeping, but not as punishment anymore, as something closer, now, to a promise kept for someone he loved, rather than a debt paid to someone he'd lost. They drove home the next morning along the same coast road, the maples giving way slowly to salt marsh and then to open water, and when the lighthouse came into view on its point of rock, gray and steady against a sky just beginning to clear after days of low cloud, Noah reached over without a word and rested his hand over Elias's on the gearshift, the way he had once rested it over Elias's hand on the door of the skiff, except this time there was no storm to face, only the quiet, ordinary fact of two men driving home together to a light that neither of them kept alone anymore. Margaret sent a photograph of Sam a week later, the boy grinning in front of an unfinished cardboard lens model, and Elias framed it and set it on the mantel beside a small brass whistle hole so that every evening when he climbed the tower stairs to light the lamp, he climbed past two reminders instead of one. The brother the sea had taken, and the brother in spirit the sea had, against every reasonable expectation, eventually given back. The debt that had once defined both their lives did not disappear so much as it transformed, slowly, into something neither man had let himself imagine possible in the years right after the storm. Not an ending ode to the dead, but a life, quietly and stubbornly built, in honor of them.